Welcome to stratnewsglobal and Bharat Shakti and Surya Ganga. We are looking at President Biden's decision to not contest in the elections this November. I have with me Mr. Arun Singh. He was India's former ambassador to the US for a perspective on what the Biden decision means. Ambassador, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you, Surya. Happy to be with you.
In a sense, this was expected, wasn't it? It was being talked about, it was being written about. There was pressure on Biden to step back. Everything kind of, or was it all just drama?
No, I don't think it was all drama. It was sort of being talked about for quite some time, especially after what was seen as not a very good performance in the debate against Donald Trump towards the end of June, where he was seen as not assertive enough, where his responses were seen as meandering, not very clear at times, and the conclusion of his statements on certain issues were not very clear. And I remember at one time, Donald Trump, in his response, said that I didn't quite understand what he said, and I'm sure he didn't understand it either. Now, that was a scathing comment. So there was a sense that President Biden had aged considerably in terms of impact in the last couple of years, and the questions were being raised about how effective would he be as a president in the second term. Many donors had stopped funding, many of the big donors, and so that's a critical indicator, also a critical enabler, because if we don't have the funds, how do you participate in the election? So that was one. Second, large number of elected members, both in the House and the Senate, were step by step calling for President Biden to step aside because they were fearing that it would impact on their numbers, both in the House and the Senate. Therefore, Democratic either control or presence in these houses would be impacted, so that the broader Democratic agenda would come under a negative impact, especially if it was a Republican that held the White House, that controlled the Senate, and also controlled the House. So there was a demand. But it was also an indication that President Biden was resisting opting out of the race. And there are many reasons. I think it's very difficult for an individual to take the final decision to say that this is the end of his career and that he was ready. And you've seen it in sports, you've seen it in politics, you've seen it everywhere. And I think in the case of Joe Biden, he's been in politics for a long, long time. There was a feeling he had that in 2016, in the run up to the 2016 election for president, after Obama's term was over, the Democratic leadership had sort of nudged him into not contesting and make space for Hillary Clinton, who then went on to lose to Donald Trump. So he felt that, because of certain preferences of other Democratic leaders, he had been prevented from running at that time. So he was feeling that he was once again being boxed in, and a sense that in the past also, when he's been under pressure, he's eventually emerged on top. And so he felt clearly, despite the other indications, that he would be the best person with a national level recognition who would be in a position to defeat Donald Trump. But the polls indicated otherwise. Most of the polls suggested that he was trailing. He was trailing even more badly after the June debate. And the Democratic leaders, in their own private polling, were coming to the conclusion that he was not doing well. So there was a lot of pressure on him. But these things don't happen till they happen. And eventually, I think he also contracted COVID a couple of days ago. He was in isolation at his home in Delaware. So I think with all that, finally, he took the call that he was going to step aside. So that's how it played out.
No, Ambassador, early on in his presidency, I think, did Biden ever indicate he would be a one-term president?
No, there was never an indication that he would be a one-term president. And, there were a lot of people talking that perhaps he is advanced in age and maybe he should look at that. But he never indicated that he was looking only at one term. Nobody does that. The earlier Democratic presidents who opted out in recent history, in the past century, you had President Truman. In 1953, you had President Johnson in 1968. And both of them eventually opted out in the March of the election year. In the case of Biden, it's August. And it's towards the end of July. But no, I think nobody indicates early on that they would be, because if he had indicated that he was going to be only one-time president, then his entire presidency would be a lame duck presidency.
Yeah,
People would just say, wait it out. You don't
true.
know how impactful his policy choices would be, how, how enduring they would be, what would be the longer term impact. So just hold out. So I think nobody indicates early in the term that they would not contest again.
So how does this impact his legacy when we look back at Biden? What do you think strikes you?
I think if he had earlier, let's say in the year March of around that time, said that he was not going to contest and that he had an impact, perhaps his legacy would have been even better. Now it would seem that because of advanced age and he's been pushed out by other members of the Democratic Party, that's certainly some notice about his legacy. But despite that, I think he has many things to claim credit for. To begin with, he tried very hard to stem the polarization in US polity, which had been extreme in Donald Trump's first term. And then whatever Donald Trump did in terms of contesting the outcome of the elections, in terms of what was seen as encouraging his followers to attack the US Capitol when the vote certification was taking place on January 6, 2021, all those were clearly unconstitutional acts. And therefore, Biden was seen as a president who was once again bringing back constitutional norms into governance in US politics. So that was clearly an important factor, especially if US wants to project itself, as they say, the shining light on the hill for other countries to emulate. But if their own president is not following constitutional norms, they cannot project themselves as being the country that should be emulated. So that was one dimension. I think the second thing Biden had done was try to move back away from what Trump had done in terms of damaging US relationship with their allies and partners, particularly in Europe. So that they have been able to revitalize, and because ultimately US, from their perspective, it's stronger if the allies work more with the US. So recently I was in Germany, Belgium, and the UK, and I could see that in Europe there was a lot of concern about a second Trump presidency, because they were wondering about what that would mean about US approach to Europe, to transatlantic alliance, US position on the Russia-Ukraine issue, on trade issue, tariffs. So a lot of uncertainty were coming into the European calculations. And aside from Russia-Ukraine, the other impact would be that if the Europeans felt that US was not 100% with them as far as they saw their security challenge related to Russia, then there were no compulsion to line up behind the US on what US saw as the security challenge related to China. So in fact, there's all this talk of decoupling, de-risking. Of late in Europe, you're not hearing that. Because at one level they are going through economic challenges because of the Russia-Ukraine conflict. They don't want to take on or stimulate another challenge emerging to the economic relationship with China. But more than that, they themselves don't see the security challenge from China as acutely as the US does. So if they see that the US is walking back from the transatlantic alliance on the China issue, US may not see Europeans as such strong partners. And so that can again have a negative impact. So that was the second thing Biden had done. Third, building on what Trump had done, not contrary to what Trump had done, but building on what Trump had done, Biden had taken measures to enhance domestic production and infrastructure building in the US. They had brought in the Infrastructure Act, Inflation Reduction Act, Chips and Science Act, using all that to enhance manufacturing in the US, improve the quality of infrastructure, get semiconductor manufacturing going in the US, which would have had good impact on the US domestic economy, but also enhance US competitiveness vis-a-vis China. And again, on minority rights and others, clearly he was much more positive towards the minorities than President Trump was. So there were many achievements, certainly, to what Biden was able to do. But now we have to see what happens, because despite everything, despite his conviction, uh, despite accusations related to fraud, not accurately reflecting the condition of his companies. President Trump continues to command huge support in the US. He has a committed following, as you've seen in public opinion polls, and as you saw in the recent Republican convention. So we have to see where the US politics is headed.
Was there was his family pushing him to stay on? I mean, we often see this kind of thing play out in India. What's your sense?
So, I mean, I don't have a direct personal assessment based on the reporting that has come in the media. It would clearly appear that his family and a small circle of people close to him who were working with him, they were the ones that he was eventually listening to. And they perhaps felt that there was no need for him to withdraw early on, and that he could still revive his chances. And maybe they realized what he wanted to do, and did not want to push him against his will. Whatever
Yeah.
it be, I think these reports suggest that eventually whatever was done in terms of decision at each level was not based on direct input from a wide range of advisors, but a small circle of advisors. But of course, he was hearing from reports coming in the media, he was hearing from public comments made by congressmen, senators,
Yeah.
public comments made by donors. So all that would be reaching him in some way or the other.
Kamala Harris, let's move on and look at the vice president. Is she a credible enough candidate for the Democratic Party?
I think so, because if you look at the polls that have been coming out so far, she's been trailing President Trump, but only by a couple of points, 2% or so,
Yeah.
which has been a smaller margin compared to by how much President Biden was trailing compared to President Trump. So that's one dimension. But these would not really be seen as very accurate reflections, because the real polls will now emerge when she is the front running candidate,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
when she could be a potential candidate. Because what the Republican Party will now do is go all out for negative advertisements against her and try
Yeah.
to frame her in a way which would be seen negatively by large from sections of the Republican followers, and they would try to reach out to other voters. The challenge for Kamala Harris's campaign and the Democratic Party is to now frame her in a way that would be seen positively. And so we have to see how that emerges. But certainly, in terms of some aspects, for example, she would be another woman candidate running for president after Hillary Clinton. And if she's elected, she'll be the first woman to be president of the US. And that has certainly potential for energizing women's vote, at least a certain percentage. And in fact, the Emily's List, which is a very important advocacy organization in the US looking at advancing the role of women in political life, they have already endorsed her. So that's one dimension. Then it's quite likely that the African American community, which is 14% of the vote of the population in the US, can be energized by her candidature and come out and vote for her in large numbers, who are not being energized the same way under a Biden candidature. And then again, it's possible that the South Asian community, especially the Indian American community, could be enthused also by her candidature. And the Indian American community size is significant. Their presence in some of the battleground states is larger than the margin by which the previous time the candidate had won in those states. So it can be a significant vote. And then the progressive wing of the Democratic Party would also be enthused by her candidature. So I think there are sufficient sections in the US voting public that will be enthused by her candidature. But then, US has not really elected a woman president so far.
Yeah.
So there could be some negative reaction because of that. In US, racism is deeply embedded problem, and therefore there could be some negative reaction because of that. We'll have to see how the balance of it plays out. But she will certainly be a credible candidate, and as the vice president, she has an advantage compared to any other candidate who emerges, because any other candidate who emerges has a very short time period. And if they see themselves as credible candidate, if age is on their side, it may be better for them to wait till 2028 when the field could be an open field, because if Trump gets elected now, who's already
Yeah.
consolidated his base, he can't run in 2028. And if Kamala Harris gets elected, then we have to see what is the situation at that time. So anybody who sees himself as a really credible candidate with age on his side, it may be in their advantage to just wait another 4 years.
I find on social media a lot of stuff coming out about Kamala Harris' early political career and maybe all kinds of things she did. I mean, one doesn't know the fact from fiction, you know. But there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, I would presume the Republicans would go all out to smear her.
Of course they will, and they will try and frame her and use whatever they can. But then the counter argument would be that all kinds of negative things have come out about Donald
Yeah.
Trump, and and he still seems to command wide following as a
Yeah.
president. So ultimately, it will be a question of what is the constituency that feels that they would benefit from a Kamala Harris presidency rather than a Trump presidency. And I think that would,
Mhm.
in my view, would be the defining factor
So,
in how the
so
elections play
these
out.
things don't matter much, is it, to the electorate? The moral character of the candidate, although they keep talking of family and this and you know, I mean, it doesn't matter, is it, to the electorate?
No, it has mattered in the past. It has mattered very often in the past, but there have been instances when it has not mattered. There was a vice presidential candidate once, very strong candidate, and there were accusations about his personal life, and he had to drop out. But in the
Yeah,
case of Bill Clinton, there were some accusations about his
true.
private life, but didn't really impact on his candidature. Then, of course, later it impacted the last phase of his presidency. But in the case of Donald Trump, he seems to have turned everything on its head. That so many things have come out against him repeatedly,
Yeah.
but there is a section of the US electorate that feels that their concerns, especially in mid US or Midwest, their concerns related to drug addiction, concerns related to immigration, concerns related to jobs, they feel that he's the one who's far more caring of their interests, whether he's actually or not. Because during
True.
his term, he actually reduced taxes for the more wealthy people. But they feel that he speaks for them. And then he's selected as the vice president, J.D. Vance. And if you read his book, clearly he defines himself as a person who grew up in the Midwest under very extreme
Yeah.
conditions that many of the Trump supporters see themselves as. So he
Yeah.
embodies them. And a lot of people are saying that in many ways he would be the flag bearer of the MAGA Republicans, the Trump Republicans in a post Trump phase.
Mhm.
So there is a section of the US population that identifies or feels that Trump identifies with their concerns and are prepared to ignore anything else that he does.
Michelle Obama, there was some buzz going around that the Democrats were pushing her to go for the presidency. What's your take on that?
Well, there's always been talk now, I think, for the last several years, whether Michelle
Yeah,
Obama could be a candidate at some stage. But as of now, I have not seen any credible indication of her emerging as a candidate. And she would again have the same problem that, if she emerges, she would be challenging another woman, an African
yeah,
American, Indian American person. And then she'd have very short time frame. So why risk your credibility in this short time
yeah,
frame?
yeah,
And also, if she emerges as a candidate, then the Trump campaign will try and call into question not just the Biden legacy, but the entire Obama legacy,
yeah.
which they did in any case in 2016. So, is it worthwhile to go through that? So I have my doubts, but I have not seen, in any case, any clear indication or credible indication so far that she could emerge as a candidate.
Mhm. Tell me, Arun Singh, you've been ambassador there. How do I mean? You this briefly came up. How do Indian Americans see Kamala Harris? Is she somebody who they see as Indian American, although she doesn't really emphasize that?
Well, she's been emphasizing that now for some years. If you see the data and all that has come out, there is certainly a very significant number of Indian American voters now. I mean, who are now American nationals.
Yeah.
Also, more and more of them are getting active in politics. Now, for a long time, because the numbers were not large and their capacity as donors was not significant, it didn't
Yeah.
make sense for politicians to identify themselves as Indian Americans. Didn't get them very far. Among the first Indian Americans to be in Congress, of course, initially you had Dilip Singh Saun, who was from
Yeah.
California. But then you had Bobby Jindal, and he didn't identify himself as Indian American. He said, I'm an American. Why should I call myself
Yeah.
an Indian American? Similarly, Governor Nikki Haley, for a long time, was not really seen as an Indian American politician. It was only
Yeah.
later, I would say 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago, when the Indian Americans started getting more active in politics and in funding of elections, that she started, emerging more and more in the framework of Indian American candidature. And in the case of Kamala Harris too, from what I have seen, in the initial phases of her career, she got strength as an African American candidate because her father was Jamaican origin, mother,
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah.
Indian American. But in the last several years, at least 7, 8 years, she has been talking more and more about her Indian American background and origin, and has done that repeatedly as vice president, including, for example, at the speech in the State Department when Prime Minister Modi was visiting there last. So, no, so clearly she's now been identifying herself both as an African American, and that's 14% of the voting population, as an Indian American, and has been unabashed about that.
Mhm. Tell me, there's the Republican Party. Do you sense that it is changing because you have this guy, J.D. Vance? He's got an Indian wife. There's a whole lot of stuff out there. All the right wing trolls are out there saying that this is not the guy you should bring in because his wife is Indian, of Indian origin. She's a Hindu. I mean, yet Trump has picked him. Is the party also changing in that sense?
So I think there are two aspects played out. My guess would be that Trump picked J.D. Vance not so much that he has a South Asian origin or Indian American origin wife, but because of what he represents as one of the people from the Midwest of the U.S. who has suffered with the kind of policies that were there in the Clinton administration, Bush administration, Obama administration, and manufacturing was being sucked out and going to China and other countries. So, and he represents that. So he wanted to consolidate that vote. And I think Trump also probably felt that if he wins, this will be his last term. So he wanted to pitch forward somebody who would carry forward his legacy, or not question his legacy when he left. So I think that was perhaps the reason. I think J.D. Vance's wife being Indian American is an additional dimension that could go to their advantage because Trump has been trying, and I saw that way back in 2016, to also reach out to the Indian American community. Because traditionally, the Indian Americans, 80% of the votes went to Democratic candidates, as they
Yeah.
did to Hillary Clinton in 2016. But in the 2020 elections, Trump got 30% of the vote of the Indian American community. He was able to pull away some. And so, if he can get more of the votes in the Indian American community, that certainly he will feel is to his advantage. Although traditionally, most minority groups have gravitated towards the Democratic Party.
Democrat,
You see
yes.
that in the Jewish vote, you see that in the Indian American vote, you see that in other minority groups. And this time, Trump will be hoping that not just the Indian American, but the Jewish vote also may come to him in larger numbers because Biden is seen as putting some pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu on issues related to civilian casualties in Gaza. So I think everybody is playing for votes at the margin so that more and more battleground states go with them rather than the opposition candidate.
So, last question: how do you see Indian Americans vis-a-vis Trump? Do you expect his vote share among them is going to increase?
I think it will increase because there is a significant section of the Indian American community that is now veering towards Trump. Still, the majority are with the Democratic Party, but there are a significant section who are gravitating and voting towards the Trump campaign. So I think probably, my guess would be that he'll probably get a larger share of the Indian American vote than he did even in 2020. Whether he'll get majority of the vote, that I remain doubtful because as a minority group, these groups tend to be more comfortable in the framework of the Democratic Party. Because you don't have any Republican Indian Americans in the House or the
Yeah,
Senate. But you had in the House Democratic Indian Americans. You had in the Senate Kamala Harris, Vice
yeah,
President. So far you haven't seen that on the Republican side. But certainly, they reach out. Also, many wealthy Indian Americans tend to prefer the Republicans because the Republicans talk of lower taxes. And so that works to their advantage.
yeah. Any guess you'd like to hazard on how the final outcome would be?
You see, I very often joke and say that the only person who can say that clearly is President Trump, because if he says he won, if he wins, he'll say he won. If he loses, he says he'll won. Nobody else knows what's going to happen.
Yeah, true, true. Arun Singh, as always, pleasure talking to you and a great perspective there. And we'll probably revisit this topic once elections are over and done. Thank you very much. Great talking to you.
Thank you, Surya. Good to be with you.
That's all we have for you on this broadcast. Do subscribe to our channel in time. Follow us on BSI, Bharat Shakti. And thank you very much for tuning in. And goodbye.